their affiliates, and deprogram radio in the United Kingdom, as well as their terrestrial affiliates in London and Leeds. And remember, when I say international, I truly mean international, because UPRN has a lot of affiliates all the way to Hong Kong, obviously Canada, because from the other night's show, right after the show was over, actually, the guest received an email from one of the listeners from Canada, and I don't know if they knew the two of them knew each other before that. Nonetheless, today you're really in for a treat. This guest I've been promoting for a while. I've actually had him on my radar for quite some time to book him on, because if you've noticed, I've taken a stance in this show where we cover all topics, and I've always wanted to talk to a homicide investigator, someone who deals with airplane crashes, and yes, we've had FBI, CIA, DIA, DEA, Secret Service, but they were never really anything like homicide investigators. Well, that's about to change today, because you're going to get a little dose of both. And we're going to be talking specifically about one major crash, airline crash, should I say, that you're going to hear a lot about. And I know the guest is very well versed, because he was the investigator. As a matter of fact, the actual airline and the flight, the website, is his very own. I've thrown you enough hints, enough for you to check out our website, of course. And of course, then that would tell you who it happens to be. It is the one and only Thomas C Juby, who is also a retired Royal Canadian Mounted Police Sergeant. With that being said, Sergeant, welcome to the show.
Retired Sergeant. Okay, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great. And you, how's your weather, by the way, out there in Atlantic time zone?
Well, we're having a little bit warmer winter than normal. We've got very little snow, but it's about 5 below Celsius would be, 25 degrees your temperature?
So you're at least still in the freezing zone.
Oh, yes, we're it's winter. The groundhog, I don't know whether you remember Groundhog Day, the movie. Well, the groundhog, he saw his shadow up here, and that means 6 months more winter.
6 more weeks, that's right, of winter. But you're not seeing it, or are you? Because I know that the eastern U.S. is definitely seeing it. And even here in Los Angeles, where by now, this time last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, you normally see temperatures in the 70s, sometimes even 80s, as was the other day. But now, as the sun goes down, it's actually dropping into the mid-30s. Not as close, nowhere near as you, Tom, nowhere near as you, or even as Joe is experiencing. But for us Southern Californians here, those who are spoiled from that hot sun, they're not necessarily getting it.
Well, I'm not heading to the beach anytime soon, that's for sure.
Yeah, especially with those temperatures. Now, I did mention that you are you pointed out retired. That's true. You are retired. 32 years work in the RCMP. Let's talk about why you joined. I mean, what made you want to join? A lot of people have different reasons. I mean, the motto in LA and probably a lot of cities in America is to protect and to serve. And some people want that as well. Others want to make their community safer. What was your personal reason, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I guess, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada is the national police force, the federal police force. It would be equivalent to your FBI. So, of course, as a young 19-year-old, you're looking to join the best organization you can. And at that time, in my perspective, it was the best organization. My older brother, he's 6 years older than me, he had joined and before me, and talking to him and whatnot, it seemed like a great organization to get into, and had lots of openings for various areas. Being the federal police, especially forensic side of it, the crime scene side of it, I liked photography, and one thing and another put together, it was a good choice.
Now, you spent 32 years total in the RCMP, but 27 of those years were in the Forensic Identification Investigation Unit, right?
That's right. I joined as a regular constable. My first 5 years was on detachment, doing municipal detachment work in northern BC. Our towns are quite small up there, but 16,000 people in Prince Rupert, northern BC, on the coast. We're right at the Prince Rupert was right at the bottom edge of the Alaska Panhandle, and we used to have a lot of American tourists coming through, going to Alaska, and they'd stop in Prince Rupert, and it was the west coast, and it was the northwest coast, so it was rainy. And after a few years doing that work, I got into forensics, into what would be crime scene investigation, CSI. And I got into it before it ever became popular.
Let's talk about the fact that and you're right, it became very popular. CSI Miami, CSI, the regular CSI show, and all the other shows that are not just titled with CSI, but really show what you guys do. And if I'm not mistaken, they've used technicians, meaning technical advisors from homicide investigators, from actual CSIs, to come on to show them exactly what is done. Now, of course, you have a television show that has the Hollywood side to it, but that's what you expect when you're watching a sitcom, if you want to call it that, or a drama. But in reality, you rose pretty darn fast to become into the CSI unit, which I'm referring to as CSI, as the Forensic and Identification Investigation Unit. That was within 5 years?
That's right. Normally it takes 10 years of detachment work, but I got in at 5 years service, and I was fortunate. I had shown an interest. I had a mentor who was who helped me a lot and encouraged me, and I was, like I say, I was fortunate. And I started out in Prince Rupert, and 27 years later, I retired in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and in between, I traveled all across the country. I was on the three coasts, the Pacific coast, the Atlantic coast, and the Arctic coast. I spent 6 years in the Arctic doing work up there.
I would imagine if you're doing things on the Arctic coast, I would imagine they would give you some warmer gear and you'd probably become acclimated and used to the weather there. Or is it even possible to do so when it's that darn cold?
It's cold. When it's 40 below, it doesn't matter whether it's Fahrenheit or Celsius. The thermometer meets on both scales. That is cold. And I'll tell you, some of the things that you adapt to, I'm dating myself by saying film cameras, because everybody, of course, now uses digital,
yeah.
And very few people use cameras other than what's in their cell phone. But at that time, a 35 millimeter camera with a motor drive on it, when you were outside and the camera was cold, you didn't use the motor drive because it would strip the film. It would break the film
because of the weather. I would imagine, yeah.
And you had to be very gentle. You advanced the film in the camera very gently because it would crack. I've lost film that way.
And you also just mentioned cell phone. These days, I hesitate to even call them a cell phone. These are pocket computers that people have in their pockets. I mean, they do pretty much everything that, say, a laptop or a desktop 20 years ago did, and then some, as far as capabilities.
That's why they call them smartphones, I guess.
That's right. That's right. Now, when you were in, I'm going to say CSI unit, you investigated over 100 homicides. Now, this is going to be an eerie question, and I know some people listening might not like the question answer, but I could only imagine what it's like to go to your first scene. Can you describe to us the apprehensions you felt and any other emotions that were coming across? Or was it already like, I'm here to solve this and to detach myself from this young person or old person, male or female, whichever it was?
Yeah, see, as a young constable, I had been to homicide scenes and assisted at them when someone else was doing the forensic work. And then, of course, you go through all the training and whatnot. And a homicide scene actually isn't a great deal different to a break and enter or a robbery scene, except that you've got a body. And you've got whatever goes with that, including, the blood and weapon and what have you. But you're approaching the scene in a very, very organized fashion. You follow a set procedure that is flexible because every scene is different. But you make sure that you process all of the evidence, no matter what it is, and you process it so that it can be given in court. And that's the main thought process that's going through your mind, is that everything that I do has to be presentable to a up here a Crown Counsel and a defense counsel, a jury, and a judge. And that's one of the main requirements or main things that's going through your mind. And you do not have time usually to reflect on the individual. You don't know them, and you're trying to solve or to retrieve all of the physical evidence: footwear, tire tracks, what have you, gunshot residue, knife wounds, and all of that. So there's a lot to be done at a scene. And of course, up here in the RCMP, we attend scenes. Only one CSI member attends a scene. And so you're doing everything.
Well, why is that, if you don't mind me asking, having just one member of the CSI team, as opposed to here where we have the lead detective and assisted by other detectives?
Well, don't forget, I'm as the forensic guy, I'm just doing the forensics. I'm not doing the witness interviews or anything like that. All I'm concerned with is the scene. And we have found up here that one guy doing it, you don't get in the way of someone else. When I'm doing photographs, I've already done a video. I've checked for footwear. I've done this. I've done that. And you if there's more than one, you tend to miss things because, well, I thought you got that. No, I thought you got that, sort of thing, eh? And I know that your guys have a different way of doing things down there in most cases. But remember, too, up here, we have a lot of isolated areas. where there's only one ident member in a very, very large area. When I was in what's called a Iqaluit on Baffin Island, I had an area that was 2,000 miles north-south by 1,000 miles east-west. Most of that was water, and the rest of it was frozen territory. But there were a large number of communities, and small communities, but a large number of them. And I was alone. I was the only guy. And because that's what the numbers called for.
Now, let me ask you this. You've done a lot of work as a CSI, from over, like I said, the homicides, over 100 homicide cases, 1,000 sudden death, over 1,000 sudden death cases, as well as fires, burglaries, and other things like that. Is there any cases that stick out to your mind besides the one we're going to get to, which I did mention at the beginning of the show, and obviously before we went on air?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of them that come to mind. You hear a name, or sometimes just a first name or whatever, and it'll trigger something about either an investigator or about a deceased person, or you hear the name of a place, and it reminds you of a scene that you did at that location. When you do more than 100 homicides, there's a lot of things that stand out in your mind and remind you. A lot of things will remind you of those scenes.
Let me ask you this: how many cases were solved? Some people here in different states call it cleared, but solved is the universal term, based on your work. I know you said there's other people involved, like interviewing witnesses, etc. But as far as what the CSI work you did yourself, how many of those would you say was mostly attributed to your work that actually caused the perpetrator, to be convicted?
Well, the thing is, a homicide investigation is extremely complicated. There's a lot of things that go into it, and it's one thing to have a suspect and to identify him at the scene. I had one where a woman shot her husband while he was sleeping.
Oof.
And she readily admitted to it. And in fact, she walked up to the road and flagged down a police truck as it drove by and admitted to the investigator that she had just shot her husband.
And sounds like remorse, almost. Guilt.
Well, she had 3 kids with her, and it was 25 below zero, and the member took her off to the next detachment and came back, and I helped him go through the scene. And he's been shot with a .22 twice in the head. So it's a homicide. But when it comes time for court, the defense, it was one of those cases where he had abused her for years and had abused the kids, and she got off on.
Really?
It wasn't it's not classed as justifiable homicide, but it's the fact that she was so intimidated by him that it was an act of self-defense.
That she feared him that much.
Feared him that much. But going into the scene, you don't know that. And you present the evidence. The defense counsel doesn't tell you what his defense is going to be. You, the Crown, or in your case, your
judge,
what do you call them,
or
no, the police and the what?
You talking about prosecutor or?
The prosecutor. The prosecutor has to notify the defense of what the evidence is. There's total disclosure up here. I guess it's the same down there. Total disclosure. But the defense doesn't tell the prosecutor what his defense is going to be. So you give all your evidence, and then you find out that this is what transpired for years, what she has put up with for years. And, it changes your outlook considerably.
Now, let me ask you this. Not just in the 27 years, what I call the CSI unit, but your 32 years of being in the RCMP, how many times did you have to go testify in court for a certain crime?
I was in court a lot. During my first 5 years on detachment, it was in the early 70s, and we had a major impaired driving problem. We used to have a fatal a month in a town the size of 16,000 people, and every one of them was a drunk driver. So there were a lot of drunk drivers, and they all pled not, or most of them pled not guilty. So you're in court a lot, and you get used to the idea of giving evidence. And every time you go to court as a police officer is a learning experience, because you learn from the Crown and you learn from the defense counsel various aspects of how you should have conducted an investigation, or how you should have done certain things. You did them a certain way. Well, why did you do it that way? And a really good defense counsel will tune in a new, fresh constable like me several times in the course of a month or two, just by appearing in court.
Now, this is a segue, but how did you go from what you were doing, specifically with homicides, and to investigating a very severe airline crash, Swiss Air 111?
Well, there were 229 people on board when it went in on the 2nd of September 1998. It crashed about 7 miles off Halifax, and it was about 9:30 in the evening Eastern time. And I actually learned of the crash. I had taken my wife to the movies. We had watched Bruce Willis and his crew in Armageddon.
Ah, yes, yes.
Yeah, I always remember where I was, what I was doing, and whatnot. It's one of those things. I remember what I was doing when I heard about JFK, and the same with Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. You remember those things. Well, this one I do, and when I came home, for some reason, I flipped through the TV channels, and I went by CNN, and ambulances are on the way to Peggy's Cove just outside Halifax. And what's this? This is, so I listened, and yeah, a big plane has gone down off the East Coast, and appears to be no survivors. Well, I was just going on to my days off. I just finished a series of shifts and being on call for a week. And I went and checked the phone, nothing on the answering machine, and I knew better than to phone into our telecoms people, because I knew they were going to be busy. And this was a major airline. This is a big airplane. So I sat down for a minute and thought about it and said, well, I'm going to be busy for the next little while, and I better get to bed. And so I went to sleep. This was a major airline. Woke up in the morning to a phone call getting to Halifax. I live 100 kilometers, 60 miles outside of Halifax. get into Halifax and into the office. We've got a major file. So I headed on in, and we had our meeting to discuss what was going to be done by whom, and I was assigned to the morgue that was yet to be built, and it was going to be in a hangar at our local naval air base, and I was going to be in charge of fingerprints of the deceased and logistics for the morgue for all the guys, and quality control to make sure that it met international standards. And so when I got over there, the floor was covered in plastic with yellow tape for 229 body bags. And I looked at it and said, this isn't going to work. And just as I'm telling the Air Force guy that we've got to do something different, a truck rolls in loaded with lumber and plywood, and the guy jumps out. I know him. He's a provincial public works guy. And he said, where do you want the rooms put up? And I looked at him and I said, let's start over here. And we ended up with a dozen rooms, plywood room, makeshift rooms, about 12 by 12. And, we ended up with a morgue that handled the remains of 229 people for 2 months.
Now, where was Swiss Air 111 going from, or going to, and where was it originating from?
Yeah, the Swiss Air 111 was an MD-11 aircraft, which is one of the stretched 3-engine aircraft. It's the DC-10 was the original 3-engine aircraft, one up in the tail, and they created the MD-11 by stretching it. And Swiss Air had bought 20 of them, and one of their routes was JFK, New York, to Geneva. And it was called the UN shuttle because a lot of UN people flew that route. Ouch. It was a daily flight, and it was also the most expensive flight to and from Europe. Maybe that's why the UN fly it, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds like about right, especially if it involves the UN and all the nations, I would imagine, that are on that flight. Just before we go further, how many different nations were represented as far as the people who were killed in that crash?
I think it was roughly 20. Wow. There were 100 U.S. citizens on board.
Ouch.
100, yeah. Some of them had dual citizenship, so I think it was roughly 100. And maybe there were 3 or 4 others with dual citizen, French, U.S., or what have you. But it worked out as most of the passengers were U.S. citizens.
Now, when you were investigating this crash, and first you started with the makeshift morgue that you said that you hadn't been built, was in the process of being built, or was being built at that time after this sad incident happened, were you able to see anything that would indicate why the plane would happen just from the bodies? Because I would think that the primary focus would be on the construction or reconstruction of the airplane and figuring out what the heck is going on, along with the black box.
Yeah, initially we knew that there had been a fire on board the plane, and the plane had been traveling out of JFK, and it had been flying at about, I think it was 33,000 feet for about an hour, and they smelled smoke. We knew that from the cockpit voice recorder, or at least that's what we were told by the Transportation Safety Board, that they had smelled smoke and the fire had gotten out of control. They had put in, they had radioed in that they needed to land, and they were directed to Halifax. But when they came in, they were a combination of too high and apparently too heavy. They had too much fuel on board. They hadn't dumped any fuel. So they did a turnaround and flew back out over the ocean to dump fuel, and they never returned.
Now, you just mentioned the Transportation Safety Board. Obviously, in the U.S., even if one citizen is killed in an airline, say, across the world, NTSB shows up. Does Canada have its own version of the NTSB?
Yes, we have the Transportation Safety Board, the TSB, and a couple of your NTSB guys were here and worked on the file. I know one of the guys quite well. He went on to work at another very important crash that occurred, a small crash down there, and they were up here for the first few months, and our group somewhat parallels your NTSB, except that from what I understand, your NTSB maintain the crash and determine if it's accident or criminal. Up here, our Transportation Safety Board only do a safety investigation. They do not do criminal, and they do not determine whether it's criminal or otherwise. And that's one of the things that became a major conflict up here, in that my management team argued that the Transportation Safety Board would tell us if it was a criminal act or if it had been an accident. And I'm saying, as we progress through, I'm saying, but there's evidence to indicate a criminal act. Well, we got to wait for the TSB to tell us that. And I told my guys, they're never going to tell us that because it's not in their mandate. Now, I kind of jumped ahead here, but that's the crux of this accident, in that there were two different factions as to how this thing should have been investigated.
Now, I would imagine, I believe I read it took 3.5 years for the investigation and reconstruction of the airplane, especially because it fell into the water, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah, what happened was the plane came in nose first. Now, everybody kind of thinks that water is soft until you do a head dive off the high board into the pool or a belly flop into the pool and realize just how hard the water actually is.
Oh, yes.
When a plane comes in nose first at 350 miles an hour, it shatters, especially when it's been flying at 30-odd thousand feet at minus 60. The metal is extremely cold and brittle, and when it strikes that water, it virtually disintegrates into pieces that most of the pieces of the fuselage you could carry through a man door. The door into your house, you could carry them through easily. Most of them, you could carry a dozen pieces in your hands through that door.
So this is actually more of a rare crash, because when I see other reconstructions of airline crashes, at least a good chunk of the fuselage is somewhat intact, at least large enough to fit in even, say, a small bedroom, not just a doorway. So if it's in that small pieces, I mean, what are the dimensions for all those people out there? Because for those who know Boeing 747s, the MD-11 is essentially the same size, right?
It is just about the same size. The tail, the top of the tail is 60 feet high. That's 6 stories. The wingspan is the length of it is over 200 feet, and the wingspan is close to 300. I don't have the figures offhand, but it matches. I on my website I have pictures in the hangar in Zurich of MD-11s parked beside a 747, and you have to look twice to see the difference between the two. They're a humongous plane, and that was one of the things. The guys from Swiss Air, the SR Techniques was the name of the company over there, who does the maintenance and maintains the aircraft, and a super bunch of guys that I dealt with when I was over there, and when they came over here and looked at the pile of rubble that we had, that was their airplane, they were just astounded. They were astonished, and some of them, virtually got down on their knees and in shock, because that humongous plane was in such small pieces. And what you have to realize too is that was one of the reasons why the morgue took 2 months, 60 days, because the bodies, when they came in, we only had one intact body. Oof. And the rest, most of it was identified through DNA, and we identified 40 people with fingerprints, 100 people with dental, but everybody was identified through DNA. But a lot of, and we called it material. We didn't call it body because of the fact that they were not bodies. And it was material that came through, and that's what we called it. And it was identified, the only way possible was by DNA.
And I would think that obviously because of the conditions and where and the devastating crash and the way it crashed and where it crashed, I would think the elements of the water degraded a lot of these, I don't want to sound morbid, but parts of people while they were waiting to be plucked from the water.
Well, you got a plane that breaks up the way that one did. You got a lot of floating material, a lot of stuff. It went into 200 feet of water, and but you've got a lot of debris, a lot of floating materials from the aircraft, and at the same time parts of bodies, and that's just a force of nature. That is all part of a natural process, as unnatural as it may seem to us. And that was one of the problems that we had, was material floating away because we couldn't get to it in time. And that would have been the same thing with the Air India crash off from Ireland and the TWA 800 crash off from Long Island. Those guys had a major problem collecting material, especially those two flights, because they broke up in the air due to an explosion. That sends material in all directions, eh?
And with regards to TWA Flight 800, there's still a lot of controversy of whether it was shot down accidentally or intentionally, or I think that controversy still continues to this day. Now, turning that to what you investigated, the title of your book, Twice as Far. Why label it Twice as Far? Did you have to investigate that much more, or was it because of all the deception and corruption that was going on and from the competing forces that were involved?
I explain in the book why I use the term twice as far. And this may seem tripe or whatever, but whatever the term might be, but I had come across a saying years and years ago in a book. It was about the Norwegian and the British soldiers who went in to take out the heavy water plant in Norway, Hitler's heavy water plant. And they met with extreme difficulties, absolutely extreme difficulties, and most of them were killed. But one of the guys wanted to commit suicide because it was so bad, and he was met by a Norwegian who told him, no, you haven't gone far enough yet. A man who is a man will go on until he can do no more, and then he will go twice as far. And that saying has stuck with me for years and years, well, ever since I read it. And it has helped me through a lot of very, very serious problems that I have encountered over the years at scenes or doing my work. And it helped me through this file too, because there were times when, especially in the morgue, when you're dealing with children, and yeah.
I couldn't imagine, honestly, seeing pieces of child. I mean, any age, from say a toddler to a 13 or 15 or old or anything. Just, I think, personally, I don't know if I could have done this kind of work, to be in the morgue. And you were in it for 2 months, right?
Yeah, well, that's where the saying helped me through. And everybody has something to help them through. And I saw a lot of guys break down and have to leave. And at one or two occasions, I had to go for a walk and had to clear my head. And the saying came to mind, and I realized that, as bad as it may be for me, there were guys who have it a whole lot worse.
Hey, that's one saying that I've always heard in my life. Better than some, worse than others, right? I mean, it applies to a lot of people, or almost everybody. If you could really if everyone can understand that statement, there always is someone suffering more versus, as opposed to someone who's more jubilant. And that exactly what the saying also very similar is, I used to complain about my shoes until I met a man with no feet. So well said, Mr. Juby, well said. Now, let me ask you, after the 2 months of the morgue, where was the reconstruction hangar for this airplane?
It's a little air base just outside, or just beside, Halifax. And Halifax is the Canadian Navy's East Coast port. What we have for a Navy is stationed there. And, of course, there's helicopters attached to the ships. And they have a land base, and it's called Shearwater. And we commandeered 2 of their hangars. They're large hangars, and one was used as the morgue, and right next door was the reconstruction hangar. And then the Transportation Safety Board actually built a hangar, or what we call the hangar. It was a Nissen hut type of establishment, plastic sheeting over it. You see a lot of barns, especially horse barns, built that way, metal frame with plastic over it in a semicircle shape. And that's what we used as a storage hangar. We had 800 boxes or so of debris from the airplane. The count on that from the TSB was 2 million pieces.
Wow.
I dealt with all 800 boxes, and I can assure you that they lost count halfway through. There was twice that many.
I would think so, especially if it had disintegrated, and the dimensions, like you said, over 200 feet long, 60 feet or 60 feet high from the tail. That's 6 stories, and the wingspan. What did you say again? It was
close to 300 feet.
Yeah, that's huge number. I would, like you said, they probably, if did not lose count, maybe just estimated what the number was and stopped counting at that point.
To give you an idea of the size, just of the engines, when I was over in Zurich, they were painting one of the planes, and one of the guys was up on top walking along the fuselage, and I saw him walking back towards the engine, the tail engine that's up in the vertical stabilizer, and he walked upright into the cowling of the engine. And this was a full-grown man walking along, and he just stepped up onto the cowling and walked right into the edge of the engine.
Wow. Yeah, like you said, that's monstrous. I would imagine the size.
That's how big that stuff is. I mean, yeah, the engine, each of the engines weighed a couple of tons.
And they have to, because, I mean, look at the weight, not just of the plane, but of the cargo, meaning the passengers, and obviously their suitcases, briefcases, or anything else that their luggage that they're transferring with them or taking with them to a port or to a destination.
Yeah, you're looking at 250 tons. And when they dump fuel, when in an emergency they'll dump their fuel. If they dump everything that the system will allow them to dump, it still retains 7,000 pounds of fuel.
Jeez. Wow. Think about that. That's an astonishing number. I couldn't even imagine at how fast the fuel would burn. And remember, every folks listening, this is jet fuel. This isn't what the 87 or 91 octane you're going to get at the, gasoline station, for your automobile. I would think that the as far as being combustible, the jet fuel is far, far more and burns much hotter too. It would have to be, I would think.
Well, jet fuel, see, it's the way the jet engine runs. The jet fuel is similar to diesel oil. And I say that gasoline is lighter than diesel oil, and jet fuel is a variation of diesel oil. But what happens is when it goes into the jet engine, it's sprayed. It's like your oil furnace, an oil burner furnace. It has a nozzle that sprays it, and you've got a system of nozzles that spray it into the air that's forced in. And you've all seen the jet engines, the afterburner and the flare out of from behind an F-16 or what have you, eh? And
yes.
Yeah, that's the gaseous, the aerosol of the fuel being pushed out by the jet engine, and it's mixed with so much air that it's so rich, and it's a glow. But yeah, it produces a lot of thrust.
Now, when you were investigating the crash of Swiss Air 111, and had to be reconstructed, especially since it was disintegrated with millions of pieces. How long did it take to actually reconstruct the plane?
Well, we had a frame. Let me back up here. We realized that the fire was confined to the forward area, the cockpit area, and overhead behind the cockpit, what we called the attic area. There is no attic in the plane, but the maintenance people call it the attic area because it's full of equipment and whatnot. And it was the forward 50 feet of the plane and above the passenger floor. There was no fire below that. So it was decided that the reconstruction was going to be limited to that. We could not rebuild the whole plane because we'd have to build a frame the size of a plane to put all those small little pieces on. But we built a frame to match that forward area. And I would imagine a lot of people, and again, it's in my website, that frame and the pieces going on it. But a lot of people that saw the news back then probably remember seeing that frame. They did a similar thing with TWA 800 and others. But that's the main reconstruction area, and that was accomplished. What actually took the time was getting the stuff off the bottom.
Yeah.
And we used a couple of different methods to get it off. First of all, divers went down and retrieved body parts and key pieces and brought them up. But you have to realize these guys are standing on dirt with 200 feet of water over the top of the head. A lot of your people will know that you don't last too long down there without having to come back up. And when they do come back up, they can only do so many dives a day. I think in this case it was only one. But we ended up with one of your Navy recovery vessels assisting on site with their divers, and just a super bunch of guys. Anyways, one of the guys ended up tearing his suit on some of the sharps that were on the bottom, and they decided that doing that was going to kill somebody, so they should go to something else. And they ended up with a barge and a crane and a grapple bucket, and they pulled up as much as they could. And that took several months. You have to realize, too, this is going into September, October, November. It's coming on winter, and winter storms in the Atlantic. The water can be real rough. It can be really adverse conditions. We were lucky for the first couple of months, and then the weather got bad, and they ended up going to a fish troll system, a scallop dragger, a chain netting that drags along the bottom. And I used to get real mad at them for doing it when they used to bring the boxes of stuff in, because what happens is the chain drags the length. They do a series of back and forth, and then they pull the thing up to take the pieces out of the chain. Well, a lot of those pieces have been dragged across stone and rock and bare ground down there, bare rock, and it misshapes, and it distorts some of the stuff, and it wears some of the edges. So it wasn't the best way to do it. And then they brought in a vacuum ship, a vacuum ship out of the Queen of the Netherlands. They use it to, the Saudis have used it to build their islands, their humongous islands. I guess the Chinese are doing it using those to build their islands out in the Spratlys. This ship actually vacuumed the bottom of the ocean in the area of that crash and sucked up all the debris, and then they brought it ashore and dumped it, and it had to be sorted, which was, I think that was a 4-week process. So you can imagine that stuff's all covered in mud and sea life and whatnot. So anyways, that
and all the elements, and not to mention the currents, I would think are pushing pieces, especially if they're so small, in a certain direction, which would make it just that much further to gather things from the bottom.
Yeah, we were limited to what the vacuum ship could do because it had time to do only one vacuum process, and later on I saw videos taken by a diver, and there was still debris down on the bottom, but we got most of it. Anyways, that stuff all came through, and let's see, I think that was completed within a year of the crash.
Now, you spent more than a year. I think it's 3.5 or 4 years dealing with this one airplane crash, right?
Yeah, I was 50 months on it.
Yeah, it's a heck of a long time. Now, I'm assuming you were going there daily or at least 5 days of the week to piece together pieces and using your CSI background, trying to figuring out what fits and what possibly had happened.
Yeah, the TSB worked 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, continuous. And because most of those guys had been brought in from elsewhere, they didn't. In fact, none of the guys that worked the crash lived in Halifax, and they came in from Ottawa and Toronto and out west. And then, of course, we had some of your people up, and then we had the Swiss Air people, the SR Techniques people in. And we had Boeing. Boeing supplied a lot of people. They were fantastic. They supplied a lot of people. And, it's amazing. You take a piece that's a piece of equipment with wires on it and take it to one of the guys and, what is this? And you look at it, oh, that's such and such. And that's located over here, and it's just amazing with so many thousands of pieces, thousands upon thousands of pieces of equipment in one of those aircraft, and these guys are so used to the equipment, and the thing is, it's like it's their car sort of thing, eh?
One thing I failed to mention or to ask you is, how long after the crash did you recover the black box recorder?
They found it within a day or two. What happened was they had an idea where it was. It had been on radar, and he dropped off radar, and at a certain time, but they had lost radio contact with them, and they knew just generally within 5 or 6 miles where they were, and they knew the exact time of the crash because it registered on the seismic recorders.
Ooh.
But they didn't know exactly, and one of the guys that I worked with, one of the key guys out of the TSB, he was on the submarine from Halifax that went out and actually located the debris field by the pingers in the black box and whatnot, and then they parked over it with the divers, and the guys fortunately were able to find them quite quickly because they were in the tail of the aircraft, not the nose, and of course the tail went in last.
Let me ask you this. Before we contacted today, I was able to read up about you, and I see that you have there was two Canadian agencies. Is that the RCMP and the TSB?
Yes, the TSB is responsible for the safety investigation, but they do not do a criminal investigation. And the RCMP was the police force with jurisdiction, and we were there to do the body recovery under the provincial statutes, what would be your state statutes, with the coroner, and we were also there to do a criminal investigation if it was warranted, because we were the police force with jurisdiction to do that. And but again, the TSB did not do anything other than a safety investigation, and that's an important point, because that's two separate entities totally. The TSB does not go to court. They do not present their evidence to court, and they deal with their evidence in a much different way. And when you read the book, you will see exactly how they dealt with the evidence, in that, and these are my allegations based on some of the people who actually did tests and were dealt with by members of the TSB. They cherry-picked the evidence to suit an accidental cause. We had strong evidence indicating an incendiary device or a firebomb on board that plane. And Transportation Safety Board refused to acknowledge it, and my bosses refused to agree with me. In fact, they told me and another member, another investigator, to take stuff out of their notes, our notes.
Why would they want? I mean, what would be the underlying reason to try to cover up the truth?
The Transportation Safety Board, you got to go back and look at the history of the Transportation Safety Board in this country. It used to be called the Canadian Accident Safety Board, CASB, and there was an air crash in Gander, Newfoundland. It was a 747 airplane that was carrying U.S. Army personnel from the Middle East back to their base in Kentucky, and I think it was they were members of the 101st Airborne. Anyways, they landed at Gander, refueled, and on takeoff they crashed. There's a book written on it by, and I know the guy, I've conversed with him. There's two books on it. One of them recently came out called Treachery, is by a fellow by the name of O'Dowd. He's a U.S. Marine, retired U.S. Marine. And he wrote this book. The evidence indicates that it was brought down. The CASB at the time said that it was icing on the wings, The evidence indicates that there was no such thing as icing on the wings, that it was above zero, and that there was no moisture on the wings at all. And there's indication that 50 of the soldiers had smoke or evidence of smoke residue in their systems. And this wasn't from smoking cigarettes. This was from a fire on board the plane. And that evidence was totally ignored, to the point that there was an investigation conducted, and the judge who oversaw the investigation ordered the CASB to re-investigate, that he didn't believe their findings. However, being a federal agency, they overrode what the judge said, and they went with that as the cause of the crash, that it was icing. But there was so much controversy that they disbanded the CASB and created the Transportation Safety Board, which was the same people, only they had different shirts on. And now we come to Swiss Air 111, and Swiss Air was the TSB's first major international crash investigation. At the same time, airlines around the world had been told to remove certain materials from the planes because it was flammable. Well, the Transportation Safety Board, I believe, wanted to reinforce that order by showing that Swiss Air 111 had been a fire that was by accidental means and got into this flammable material, which caused the death of 229 people.
Now, this brings to the next major question. Accident versus a criminal on purpose crash, maybe by a terrorist or something like that. At what point in your investigation did you realize something fishy is going on, aside from when you were told to remove things from your notes, and when you started to realize that everything is not as it seems?
There had been a fire on board the plane, and any fire in an environment where there's electrical wires will usually result in short-circuited wires, which means that two live wires cross, they spark and melt and usually blow a fuse. We had in the neighborhood of 30 of those short circuits on board this aircraft from the debris. That would have been a natural thing. What happened was there's a U.S. professor, and I think he's in Louisiana, University of Louisiana. A guy by the name of Dr. Anderson had been doing work with short-circuited wires in fires, and he came up with his own theory based on a long-standing scientific theory. And basically what it is when those two wires cross, those two live wires cross, and they create that spark, that's because they get extremely hot. They're hotter than the sun at that moment. There's a long-standing physics law that a molten material will absorb the air that's around it. The hotter it is, the more air it absorbs. Well, this Dr. Anderson realized that if you have a short-circuit wire that starts a fire in a residence, the moment that it is hot enough to absorb the air that's around it, that's clean air. That's just normal, clean air. As the fire progresses, more wires will short circuit as a result of the insulation burning away. As they short circuit and melt at that moment, there's smoke in the air, so it absorbs the elements of that smoke. And when you test for it, you can tell the difference, one from the other. And he was successful in at least one case that at that time, 20 years ago, one case, he had gone to court and proven that a short circuit had not caused a house fire. Well, the Transportation Safety Board decided to try this method to find out which wire had caused the crash, caused the fire. We knew the cause of the crash. It was the fire. We had to determine the cause of the fire. So we found that a PhD, a doctor in Ottawa, Canada, who was the best in the country and considered the best in North America, doing the testing and using the equipment that was required to do this testing. And when he did the first series of tests, I was there. I was there for all of his tests. And he came into me one day and he said, "You've seen the readings for these short circuit wires. Do you realize what it means?" And I said to him, "I know enough chemistry to know that there's stuff there that shouldn't be, but you're going to explain it to me so that I can say that you explained it to me." And what he did was basically he gave me a scenario where there was an incendiary device on the plane, a bomb made of magnesium, iron, and aluminum. Magnesium powder, iron rust powder, and aluminum powder. When you put those ingredients together, you've got a guy down there who wrote the Anarchist Cookbook.
Yes.
And that's where I first saw this stuff, because when I came back from this doctor telling me this, I looked up on the internet, and lo and behold, up comes his book, and there's the ingredients in him talking. He was writing about burning a hole through an engine block of your neighbor's truck because you're mad at him. Things like that, eh?
Revenge,
and basically,
right? Yeah.
What's that?
Revenge,
yes, whatever it is. Anarchy. Anyways, he had it fully described. It was on the internet, as young as the internet was at that time, and it was out for public consumption. And here were these ingredients. We were finding them in these beads, these short-circuited wires from the plane. So they had to that material had to have been in the air during the fire. So now it became a point of, where did it come from?
And who put it there, right? I would think.
Well, no, not first. Where did it come from? Did it come from a normal source on the plane? Did it come from the seawater? Or did it come from something added criminally? So it began a search that lasted for I think it was about a year, testing different materials. We ended up going to Seattle, and we created short circuits, and so that he could test them. And we had the paint analyzed. We had all kinds of the flammables burnt and the smoke analyzed, and nothing showed those ingredients. And what it was, and the argument was, well, it came from the skin of the plane, which is an aluminum, magnesium, and other elements, an alloy. Well, the problem was, number one, the fire didn't get hot enough to burn the skin. There was no burn through of the skin of the plane, and it didn't get that hot. It melted but it didn't burn. A melt does not put those elements into the air. It simply creates a liquid that drops. And so the other thing was we had, for example, one bead would show magnesium at 45% with no aluminum and no iron. Others would show just iron. Well, where did the iron come from? There's no iron up there. And others would show just aluminum with no magnesium and none of the other elements. Seawater. Seawater contains every element on Earth, just about. And none of those elements were showing up. So how could it possibly have come from seawater? Well, the argument also was put forward that, well, those short-circuited wires were resting on magnesium pieces from the airplane. Well, it turns out that the only pure magnesium pieces in the airplane were the 4 rudder pedals in the cockpit, well below the fire zone, and small pieces in the door mechanism that locks the doors. Very small nuts and bolts. Certainly not enough to contaminate that many wires. But we ran tests, and we put short-circuited wires against pieces of magnesium rudder pedal in salt water for 30 days. And when they were tested, there was no transfer. So basically what happened by the time we got done all the testing, this Dr. Brown in Ottawa, he put out a report, and his first report that he put out used the term sabotage and criminal device as the cause of the fire. Well, what happened was that's when they started coming aboard me. My people started coming aboard me and checking my notes and then demanding that I take this material out of my notes. And they went to this Dr. Brown, the Transportation Safety Board, went to Dr. Brown and told him, do you want to get paid? Because if you read the fine print of your contract, you're on a civil contract to perform these tests. And these tests have to meet, the results have to meet our requirements, or you don't get paid.
Now, let me ask you this. Briefly, let me mention, you said Seattle. That's where Boeing has their headquarters factory, right? That's where you went?
Yeah, I went to Seattle. I was in the electrical lab, and was there for 2 weeks. And we did short circuit. And again, another great bunch of guys. I mean, the people that work that area, the airline industry, in an incident such as this, everybody is more than willing to bend over backwards to help you. And those guys out there, the Boeing people, they were fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And they, when they were running they set up a system. They'd never done it before. They set up a system to create short-circuited wires under various controlled conditions. And I was videotaping them and dealing with the exhibits. Again, I was working alone, doing the forensic work of it. And somebody complained that it was taking too long. And one of the guys went outside to where these spectators were. They were watching it on a monitor, and basically told them to shut up, that they're doing the work and that they're going at my pace. And when I tell them to start the next test, that's when the next test is going to start, not them telling him.
Now, once you realized all these things that cannot be attributed to as natural or even accidental, what did you start to conclude, or to at least start to think before you reached a conclusion?
Well, the doctor told me that one of his prime scenarios was an incendiary device, and we worked towards trying to find a legitimate cause for the materials, and we couldn't find anything. And then I ended up going to the FAA in Atlantic City, just outside Atlantic City. They have the FAA headquarters down there. The TSB arranged for some burn tests, and I went down to video and photograph the stuff and to help them because at one point I was the only guy that knew the layout of the overhead of the MD-11 on the Swissair MD-11. There were only 2 or 3 of us that had been on the planes to see what was there. I was the only RCMP member, and in fact, I had gone to Zurich on my 3rd trip. I went over alone to retrieve insulation blankets and other things and take a series of photographs. I took more than 50,000 photographs when I was on those planes. And when I asked my TSB supervisor why he was sending me alone, he said because he doesn't have anybody else that knows the plane as well as me. So I had gotten to know that plane very well, that overhead burn area. And when we went to the FAA in Atlantic City, I helped them set up the tests and then recorded it. And basically we found no materials that acted abnormally, in that nothing all of a sudden was a runaway burn, material that produced excessive heat. It was all within the expected parameters. And we ran a series of burns with a mock-up of the overhead area using similar materials and as close as possible the same layout. And basically, we could not get the material that was there to melt aluminum. In fact, the head of the FAA Burn Center, a fellow by the name of Dr. Lyon, he came to us one day and he said, "You realize that you had an incendiary device over the top of that plane?" And like, yeah, I do, but the TSB don't. And he said, "We've been doing burns here of materials from airplanes." He had been doing it for more than 10 years. His crew had been doing it for 16 years. And he said, they never melted aluminum unless they added petroleum product to the burn material. What was in the plane by itself will not burn that hot to melt aluminum. And we had extensive molten aluminum in our aircraft.
Were you able to conclude that this was in fact intentional and criminal? And if so, were you ever able to track down who caused or planned this crash?
The first part of the question is, did I come to a conclusion? Yes, I have gone through my notes extensively. I've spoken to Dr. Brown in Ottawa, and I just recently received a written statement from him, and the TSB virtually admitted, the head of the TSB investigation, when he threatened Dr. Brown with non-payment and told him to change his report, he virtually told him that he realized Dr. Brown was correct in his assessment of test results, but that it didn't matter. They wanted a safety report. They did not want a criminal report. As for any follow-up, by the time I learned all of this, I was retired. I retired in 2002. And I had been, I finished the file. I finished in the hangar in January 2002, and I went back onto my section, and then I retired in September. And I actually got called back to work on the file in December for the TSB. And then I was all done. And I had been so adversely dealt with by the RCMP. My managers had, and I describe it in the book, they refused me a promotion. I had applied for a training position at a police college in Ontario, and I know that they were instrumental in refusing me that position. Various things, and the assessments that they did, and it's funny because Dr. Brown's bosses did a bad assessment on him, that he fought and won and got the assessment thrown out. Well, I had a bad assessment done on me to the point that I was not promotable. And I fought it, and I won it, but it took 6 years. I'd already been retired 5 of those years.
That's actually really sad that they wanted to have only a safety report and to suppress the criminal report. Now, especially
not
someone
only,
like... Go on.
Not only, it's illegal.
Yes,
yes. I contend that these guys broke the law. They broke serious... You have laws down there as well, obstruction of justice, obstruction of police officers, dealing with witnesses when you adversely influence a witness. I can't think of the term right now, but a potential court witness when you influence him in the way that Dr. Brown was influenced, in the way that I was influenced, and how I was dealt with. Those were criminal acts. To come to me as a police officer and tell me to change my notes and give me a signed piece of paper. The officer signed it that I would change my notes. That's an illegal act. That's obstruction of justice. That's 14 years in jail.
And I'm assuming, obviously, no one went to jail because this seems to be a larger conspiracy than that, especially if it came from the top down to you. And for you, having such a long tenure in the RCMP and doing phenomenal work, for them to treat you as horribly is just more than a sad situation. It just begs the question, why? Why do they want one of their crack investigators or CSIs to not present the facts? And like you said, obstruction of justice right there would have caused them to be, somebody or a group of people to be obviously sitting in a prison cell.
Let me run this one by you. When the guys went to, within a week, some of the investigators, the RCMP investigators went down to New York, to JFK, and met with the FBI and the Port Authority police. And their intent was to interview all of the people who had worked on the plane prior to its departure. That's normal procedure. When they got the list and had finished up, there was one name left. Where's this guy? We don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, We don't even know if that's his name because he gave false ID. He worked the one shift, worked on Swiss Air 111, and left. And he was never seen or heard of again. And what he did on the plane, nobody seems to know. Where he went, who he was, nobody knows. The comment of your people down there, and my people were silly enough to accept it, was, oh, that's okay. We routinely have people work the one shift, give false ID, and then leave. They're aliens, and they're working illegally. My comment to that was, and how many planes crash 2 hours later that guy has worked on? Doesn't that ring a red flag?
Huge, absolutely huge red flag right there.
It should have been a very, very serious red flag. When I brought it up with my people up here, when I heard it, I literally hit the roof. And it's a high hanger. And what's the matter with you guys? You didn't follow through? Oh, no, it's routine, and besides, we wouldn't be able to find him anyways. Well, how do you know who he was? And what did he do on the plane? So, and then another thing, who were the passengers on the plane? We were given names and birth dates. I was given a series of fingerprints. I identified 40 people to fingerprints. But who were these guys? Who were these 229 people? Well, we know the crew, so take the 12 crew members out. Who were those other people on that plane? Why were they on the plane? It was a UN shuttle, so okay, there's UN people. What were they doing on the plane? Why were they there? Who were their enemies?
Yes, big question.
We don't know, because by day 3, passenger profiling was ordered to be ceased. Do not do any more passenger profiling.
Really? So that's another thing that was also coming up from up top to stop the truth from coming out. I mean, can you speculate as to why they wouldn't want you to know the profiles of these passengers?
I have no idea, other than there was somebody on board they didn't want anybody to know about.
And it's possible, do you think that one person on board may have been the whole reason for this wreck in the first place? Or was it that one person on board was possibly a target and these other 228 people were just collateral damage?
Your guess is as good as mine, because that wasn't part of my investigation. I had enough to do with the physical evidence. That area was supposed to have been done by the other investigators, and it never was. That's part of a criminal investigation. And that's where I say a large number of people go into a criminal investigation, and a lot of people have different tasks, and that's one of them. One person should have been assigned to each of those passengers to chase down their history. Who are they? Why are they there? There were all kinds of things on the internet as to different groups, military groups going over, wherever, going to Geneva and then catching a flight on elsewhere. I don't know. I have no idea if that was ever verified by anybody or who or what. It certainly wasn't verified by the investigators. There was supposed to have been a retired or a disgraced MI6, British MI6 agent on board, a fellow by the name of Richard Tomlinson. He was Lady Diana's bodyguard, or something to do with Lady. When you look up Richard Tomlinson on Wikipedia, he comes up as Lady Di's bodyguard, and he was about to spill the beans on some underhanded tactics of MI6 or what have you. Anyways, he flew across, landed at JFK, and was supposed to be giving a lecture at a university in the Midwest. And the British MI6 asked the U.S. authorities to deport him. And he was taken off the plane. The term in the Wikipedia is he was frog-marched off the plane, and he was put back on another plane heading back to Europe. His return ticket the following day was supposed to have been Swiss Air 111.
So is it safe to at least speculate that a criminal device was possibly linked to him on the aircraft?
Well, MI6 has a reputation somewhat similar to your CIA, but and of course your CIA has never done anything like that, I would suppose, eh?
Yeah, well, at least we could say that, though, right? I mean, they won't admit it, even though I've interviewed...
They're probably listening to this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially since I've had quite a few of the CIA members of the CIA on, and even the NSA whistleblower who has to stay out of the country because of the fact that I'm sure he's probably wanted for him to shut up. I would think that's what their goal is if you're talking about the discrepancies of what's going on top and things like domestic spying. But that's a whole other case. The point is that there's a lot of corruption that seems to go at, just like you mentioned, with the CIA and MI6 being the British equivalent of the CIA for the US, or for the UK versus CIA for the US.
Well, you have, as far-fetched as it this all may sound, just stop and back up. The Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at the time ordered my supervisors to discredit me so that I could never give evidence in court. They tried to do that by having me change my notes, by pressuring me into changing my notes. It would have discredited me for any court case so that I could never give evidence in a civil case or a criminal case. I did not change my notes. I refused to, although I did sign the paper saying that I would, so that I would have a copy of that piece of paper. And that piece of paper is on my website on the internet. What the RCMP did with my notes, I have no idea. They probably did alter them, but I did not, and I still have my original notes today. However, if the head of the RCMP, a law-abiding organization or a law-keeping organization, can do something as illegal as that, then what about an agency like MI6 who deal in those serious underhanded things? The CIA has a reputation of it.
Yes.
I'm not saying the CIA was involved in this, and I'm not even saying that MI6 did. I don't know. But if you want to speculate, there's an area. Another thing was there's $1.5 billion worth of diamonds that were on board, supposed to have been on board, that were never found.
Jeez, and that's a huge motive, $1.5 billion worth right there. I would imagine that in someone's hands. Was that even discovered?
Well, we don't know if they were on board. We have it was never verified that they were on board. We don't know how they were on board. Were they as cargo or were they as a courier? Was a courier carrying them? I do know that there was a search done and a courier's briefcase was found and retrieved. however, because it was handcuffed to an arm. But what was in that briefcase, or if there were diamonds, or if they were ever on board. There was supposed to have been a Picasso worth $1 million. I did see the frame. Part of the frame came through the morgue. It was a gold gilded frame, and just a portion of it. But we never did retrieve the Picasso, and we don't know.
It sounds like almost like a skyjacking for monetary reasons. I do have to say we have a little over 5 minutes left, and I want to cram as much as I can in here real quick. Let me ask you this, Tom. Since you've done this investigation, since they've had to try to suppress the knowledge and even change the outcome, you've said they've tried to make you uncredible as far as testimony in court. Has there been anything else they've done? Because what I'm guessing is they're not liking the fact that you're talking about this right now.
Well, what I've done was I've been on a number of interviews. There was a documentary done up here on CBC, and I've written a book and I put out a website. The book is called Twice as Far, and the website you can get on it www.swissair111.com. SWISSAIR 111.com, and it's got the book Twice as Far is available on Amazon, and I cover. I present the story. I present the facts there, and all of the stuff that's in the book is shown on the website. And what I've also done on the website is I put in a lot of photographs, and I put in a lot of other documentation, and I've copied areas of my notes, key areas of my notes. And it's an expensive website. But you get onto the site map or the timeline, and you can go through and read how this thing went down. And you just follow through, just from the index, go to the first page and follow through, and you'll see the photographs, how it was brought up off the ocean, how it was reconstructed, and then it goes into the various tests, and there's videos there showing the various tests of the wires and some of the burns, or most of the burn tests. And I call one of them the fraud burn, because they created a test that used more than 6 times the amount of material that was overhead the plane, and then they put that forward as, see, that material can melt aluminum, and this is what happened.
That's the unfortunate part, that the fact that you have to show the evidence through your site and interviews, as well as the documentary and book that you wrote. But I'm guessing right now somebody up top is probably maybe even listening or knowing that you're on here tonight and not liking the fact that you're bringing this up, even though this is a case that literally crashed. The airline crashed just about 20 years ago at this point. I mean, calendar year, as far as 20 years, that's it's a long enough time. Have they tried to make your life hell recently in any way?
Not recently, but they did a good enough job to begin with that it screwed everything up, and I watch over my shoulder. If a car stops in front of my house, I look to see who it is. I don't ignore it.
You pay attention, more vigilant, I would think, especially now, and not to mention with all the time you spent in the RCMP over 3 decades. I would think because of what you've encountered as far as being a constable all the way to a sergeant, has given you some sort of, I don't want to say, what's the proper word? You probably have different parts about you or different traits that make you more readily available to stop a threat than those of you who have not been through that training.
Yeah. There, and I'm a big guy too, so.
Well, Tom, it's been an honest pleasure. I do ask if you could please hang by after the show real quick so we can have a quick chat when we end. But if you have a final statement, and I do want to plug in your website and book yet again, what would the statement be? And then let's go ahead, even though you just mentioned it less than 10 minutes ago, the swissair111.com. And it is posted on our website as well for all those who want to check it out. But go ahead and say your final statement of what you would say if you were to encompass this entire show, or to what you're doing as far as doing these interviews, what you're attempting to accomplish by keeping this alive.
Well, I realize that it's been 20 years, and a lot of people would look at this and say, well, this is old news. But the problem is, and especially in this country, we had 3 major crashes, including Swissair, in this country. And they were nothing but screw-ups, as far as I'm concerned. And we know for a fact that the first one was totally screwed up. And then there's Gander, and then there's this one. And if you do not learn from your mistakes, you will, what's the saying? You don't
repeat them. If you don't learn from your mistakes, you're bound to repeat them.
That's right. So, I honestly believe that we have to be aware of our history, and this is part of our history. And you people lost 100 people, 100 citizens on this flight. There's a link here to 9/11, because we should have told the FAA that this was a bomb on board, a firebomb on board. It was 9.5 months before 9/11 that we knew we had proof that something was wrong. And 9.5 months later, I walked into my office, or into the office, and told my boss, I told you so.
Well said.
I was in Atlantic City when 9/11 occurred, and I saw those fighter jets flying overhead with the rockets on board. Our fighter jets don't carry rockets. Yours that day did.
I would see why after, especially an attack like that. Well, listen, I gotta say, Mr. Juby, it's been a true pleasure, and I do want to give some shout outs. First of all, we have UPRN owner Joe Montaldo, United Public Radio Network, and all the affiliates that are associated with 107.7 FM in New Orleans, as well as JC of Deprogram Radio in the United Kingdom. Also, my social media manager, Pam Vrettenberg, and as well as Josh Cheris, who is my assistant producer, and much more than that. Remember, folks, all you have to do with regards to the show is remember the name of it, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. Every social media account from Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, Facebook, Minds, YouTube, BitTube, you name it. If there's a social media account of some sort, it's the name of this show. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J. I wish you all a good night or good morning if you're in the EU or UK. And you have enjoyed the next show, and we will be back same time, same place on Monday.